so I think we can accept that the minutes are a correct record, and we've not got any matters arising that we know of that where we're not dealing with any follow-up in its own right. So the first item is the risk management update. We've got an updated force risk register. We're going to just have a discussion on where we're at with the formulation of a new risk register for the commissioner. So Mark, are you leading on that, or is Veronica coming straight in?
Chair, I can just talk about the commissioner's risk register.
Okay.
As you know, the risk management risk register is based on the police and crime plan. We're currently in development stage of the new commissioner's police and crime plan. So obviously the risk register is still in development as well. So we will bring that to a future committee when it's finalised.
Okay, so I think Richard had got a question to raise on that process. So if we just take that, then we'll move on to the actual register for the force.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Mark, I'm just interested. I get the principle of a new commissioner, an outgoing commissioner, and an incoming one, and they'll have different plans and ideas. But I'm just interested to know that, operationally, the commissioner's office is still running. So even at an operational level, there must be some operational risks, and presumably there was a handover. So were there not risks arising from that transitional period from the handover? It'd just be helpful to get to fill that in with some detail, if you could, please.
Yeah, so obviously the risk register was based on the police and crime plan, and the commissioner has till the end of the financial year. The new commissioner has till the end of the financial year to develop it. We are still, as you may know, we're still planning to hold board meetings around holding the force to account. In the sort of work in progress stage of the police and crime plan. So from a governance perspective, that is still in operation. In terms of the risks themselves that carried over, obviously it really depends on what's in the police and crime plan, and what carries over from the manifesto. So obviously there's lots of things in the commissioners in any sort of elected representative manifesto that would probably feature in a police and crime plan. So from managing the risk, obviously we've still got governance in place. We've got a PCC in place, and we've now got a board in place that will hold the force to account in terms of delivery. Obviously the work plan of the board as well is being developed as well. So there's meetings of the board planned in July, and they will be planned in September as well, whilst we're in that work in progress stage of the police and crime plan.
I can see that Jonathan's got his hand up, so I'll bring in the Chief Executive, Jonathan Jardine.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks for the question. I think it touches on the distinction between the operational management of the Office of the Police and Crime Commissioner versus the delivery of the Commissioner's Police and Crime Plan. So in terms of managing the risk associated with transition, I tend not to characterise the democratic process as risky. It is what it is. The management team and the OPCC put in place a series of measures to ensure that we were ready to induct a new Police and Crime Commissioner and initiate the processes for delivery of the stated objectives that all the candidates had prior to the election. So we put to I guess there was a management risk register of sorts that set out, okay, we are having to ensure that we are appropriately engaged with the election process. We did that, that we have in place the actions to induct a new Police and Crime Commissioner, and we're doing that now, and also and be ready for initiating the process of generating a new police and crime plan. But I would think that operational management risk inside the OPCC is distinct from the risk register for the Police and Crime Commissioner, which is, as Mark said, is based on the police and crime plan, which we're generating now. So by by the end of the summer, sort of September, October time, we'll be in a place to have a police and crime plan ready for publication, and we will then use that as the basis for understanding the risks that present to the Police and Crime Commissioner and achieving their objectives. So I guess I'd make that distinction between the kind of operational management of the office, which we don't tend to bring here, because that's a management issue, versus the risk register for the PCC, which is the ability, extent to which we are achieving the objectives they set in the Police and Crime Plan.
Thank you. That's helpful. I mean, actually, if we'd have had some content around that, that would have been helpful and probably would have negated my question. But thank you for filling in the gaps for me.
I mean, no problem at all. Of course, I take the point.
Okay.
You're right.
Okay. Thank you very much for the question, Richard. So we'll move on to look at the force risk register and bring in Veronica to introduce that to us.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. I'm standing in for Harry today, and the updates we have for the risk register, we've removed one risk from the risk register around Britain's exit from the EU and added 3 new corporate risks. With the easing of the national lockdown, the demand pattern across the force is gradually increasing. So the trend we have for demand management, that's CR 41 and 44, the trend is going upwards for those 2 risks. In the final weeks of Q1, there's been an increase in the calls to our service centres and force contact centres. And on some days, there's been an increase of up to 20% more demand on the services. For the COVID-19 risks, there's been some reduction in the residual risk trend. We haven't removed both risks from the risk register yet, as with the delay with the lifting of the lockdown, there are still some control measures in place, and we are still, there's some ambiguity around the different variants and the different further waves and increase in infections across the region. But we do actually have mitigations in place around that. So we're encouraging staff to take part in the national vaccine programme, and staff are self-reporting their vaccinations once they take the first and the second dose. For the 3 new risks around Plato embedding, so that's an operational risk and the impact it's having with the there's a national rollout of some new training for operational staff, and it's the speed required to adopt these changes and increasing it with the increased demand to operational service levels. We've added the Commonwealth Games resourcing mutual aid requirements around that, and just for the force to have oversight around the impact it could have with service delivery. And also we've added the risk around the connect and issues around data being brought over from the legacy systems. Also to update the force is we are currently, there was a review done late last year, and we are currently updating the risk management process across the force. So at the moment, developing a risk appetite statement, reviewing and updating the full corporate risk register, and also rolling out across the force an updated risk assessment methodology so it can be applied consistently across the force. And obviously reviewing and updating the approach so that we can actually provide more clarity around roles and responsibilities and the governance around risk management and the decision-making bodies and how risk get escalated upwards across the force. Okay, happy to take questions.
Okay, thank you very much for that. So are there any questions, Richard?
Yes, thank you, Veronica. I've got a few. Is it okay if I just rattle through them? Is that okay?
One, yeah.
So my first one is thanks for the information on the new risks. The one on, I think it's paragraph 2.5 of your paper.
Yep.
That's the third point, which you've already touched on about the Connect system and the challenge of legacy systems. And I'm just interested, what's the practical impacts of that data not being able to kind of be brought over? Does it mean we still retain the old software to hold the data? Does it mean we still incur license costs to run that software? I'm just interested, and you may not be able to answer this. Next bit of that question, Veronica, is kind of how do we get there? Do we not pick that up earlier on in the project?
Okay. So we are retaining the legacy systems. However, that may not be something I'll be able to give you more details on. I'll bring in Neil Chamberlain here to answer this.
Thanks, Veronica. Chair, if I may. So yeah, Richard, you're quite right in terms of the back record conversion. We took a decision as part of the project to bring a whole host of data from legacy systems across into Connect. As you'll be aware, I mean that went into something like 6 or 7 million items of data. So there was a sizable amount. Lots of testing was done beforehand, lots of accuracy checks around the convergence of that data from one system to the new one. And I think, if I'm brutally honest, I think we were at something like 99.9% accuracy. So what we're talking about now very much is the tip of the iceberg in terms of some of that back record conversion. We're still working through that, and a lot of it's very, very historic. So it doesn't have an impact on operational policing and the data we're maintaining in the legacy systems. We will probably hold on to the legacy systems for slightly longer than we planned for, but this is a trajectory now to, I guess, iron out some of those creases and just move across in a accurate way in terms of making sure all that data is right. A lot of it was down to the accuracy of the data originally input into the legacy systems, and how that transferred across. So that's being managed as part of the post-implementation of the project. But we haven't got any strong views at this stage that we will have to reverse the decision to retain the legacy systems. So it's very much a temporary position, and I think this will be reflected in the risk register going forward.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. Thank you. Can I keep going? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Paragraph 2.8, and again, you touched on it as well, Veronica, about the risk appetite. And I'm just interested how you set risk appetite, if that idea is fully formed yet in terms of your team. And what I've seen sometimes is organisations set a blanket risk appetite, so it's one appetite across all risks, which in my experience doesn't tend to work. So it tends to be almost by theme or objective, they flex the risk appetite. And I'm just interested how, if you've got thoughts on that already, how that's going to work.
So thanks for the question. At the moment, we have a number of risk categories, and we're using the Orange Book, the government's Orange Book, as good practice. And within those risk categories, we're using a thematic approach, so different risk areas within each individual risk categories, because for an individual risk category, there may be varying levels of appetite within that itself. So I do appreciate what you've said, and I've seen that before, as well as a blanket risk appetite level sets that doesn't allow for, so if we have a cautious level, it doesn't allow for innovation and risk taking for some of the areas that have a lower impact with regards to reputational, and possibly with security and operational, we'd have a much more risk averse appetite. So that is being developed across risk areas, and it's not just a blanket risk appetite for the force.
Thank you. Can I move on? You touched on risks 41 and 44, where they were going up, and I'm just interested, are the existing measures fit for purpose and proportionate in your view, or do we need to do something extra or different on top of that if the risks are going up?
I think for 41 and 44, I think for this particular quarter, what's actually happened is that we've been in national lockdown for the past 12, 18 months. And there's been an increase in demand with the easing of the national lockdown, with the easing of social restrictions. So I think this is something that can be monitored over the next few quarters, and we'll get a clearer picture. I just think the last time this was presented to Joint Audit Committee, we were still within a national lockdown. So there was the weather obviously was different. That does have an impact on demand and lack of social interactions and educational settings closed down. So I think this will be monitored over the next few quarters, and I think possibly September or December, Joint Audit Committee would probably be able to give you a better response to those mitigating controls.
Thank you. Last one from me, and I'll let somebody else have a go then. At 48 and 49, and the kind of, you know, the operational, the ability to respond, and the kind of the resilience of the workforce. I'm just interested, are you seeing anything different now that we're starting to come out of the pandemic, hopefully, and we're starting to kind of ratchet up the number of vaccinations? Are other issues becoming visible? So, you know, higher staff absences, stress, mental health issues?
For the specifics of those numbers and percentages, I would have to go back to get the correct information from the relevant departments. But what we have put in place, we have put in lots of wellbeing initiatives across the force after lockdown, because we do recognise things like long COVID, the impact that, you know, the service, the increased demands, and also the way we've been working over the past 18 months has had on people's mental health and stress management. So we have had many. We have a new employee assistance program provider. We've had numerous roadshows for staff with the return back to the offices, and that's taken into consideration people's well-being and any anxieties they may have returning back to pre-pandemic operational levels. I think Neil wants to come in here again.
Yeah, thanks, Veronica. Just in terms of context, Richard, so I've got a few stats live off the system this morning. It appears that, and as Veronica said in her narrative, that officers and staff have to self-reporting to us whether they've had the vaccination or not. So we do rely on their self-declaration. But from that, 96% of staff and officers have had the first or second dose, and 43% have definitely had both of the doses of the vaccination. So it gives you a bit of a context as to where we are. And I think Veronica's right, we can come back with you on more clarification around data on terms of sickness over the last 12 months. But I would say that anecdotally, I think the sickness in the force has been below what we'd have expected this year, which I think is really successful. So,
thank you, everyone. It's very helpful. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Richard, for those questions, and thank you, Neil, for actually filling in the numbers. That's quite impressive in terms of what we know about vaccination levels, and it'd be interesting when you do have them to do that comparison on absence levels compared to a year when we've not got a pandemic. I mean, we're all noting, I think, that, for instance, there's been very little flu this last winter, which does normally cause a degree of absence. So you know, it's interesting the side effects that the pandemic has had in some ways. I think that's very helpful. Did anybody else want to come in on anything on the risk register? Yes, Lynn.
Sorry, could I just make just one observation, really? The new risk around Operation Plato embedding, just to recognise this as a new risk on the risk register. It was one that we picked up as part of our audit of the preparation for a marauding terrorist attack. So just to recognise, really, that we're happy to see that on the risk register. When we did the audit, the take-up of that training was particularly low, and it was recognised that there was a lack of CPD days allocated to it. So that is something that we'll obviously follow up as well as part of our routine follow-up process, but we're happy to see that recorded and recognised on the risk register.
Thank you for that. That's helpful. And just before Neil comes in, the one reflection that I had on that interchange that you had with Richard, Neil, about the legacy systems was just to check back with you that the results of some of the audits that we have done on some of the risks around the legacy systems have been fully taken into account in that decision to hold them for longer, because we do recognise, and that the audits have underlined, that those in themselves do have a number of risks associated with them.
Yeah, thanks, Sue. Yeah, exactly right. obviously monitoring those very, very closely, and we knew Connect was going to be the answer to a multitude of audit recommendation that Lynn and the team have made. So we are keeping a very close eye on that along with the project. And we certainly won't be keeping legacy systems longer than we need to. We'll be, mindful of the risk, but also not holding on for systems just for a belt and braces approach. I was just going to touch on Lynn's comment really about Plato, and just to again give you some assurance about how seriously as a force we are embarking on this. We had a leadership day yesterday where 150 senior leaders all dialed in virtually with their senior leadership teams, and we had a desktop exercise of a marauding terrorist attack, and went through everyone's roles. We included third-party stakeholders, including ambulance and fire as part of that, and they joined into that sort of desktop. So it was a really successful session. I think lots of clarity and learning from other forces who have unfortunately gone through some of these exercises, and just understanding our business readiness, if you like, for responding as and when we need to in this sort of a rare area. So just to give you a bit of context around that.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you. Okay, so I think that's all on the risk management update. Thank you very much, Veronica, for your assistance with our questions on that. And we will leave that and move on. We've next got Her Majesty's Inspectorate update, and we've not got Inspector Rachel Jones-Burns with us today. We've got Chief Superintendent Marsh, who I think is with us. Yes, she is. Very good to have you with us for the first time. So if you could just give us a brief update, you can rest assured that the members will have read the paper very thoroughly, and then we'll see if there are any questions on the current position. Thank you.
Can I just check if you can hear me well?
We can, yes, thank you. Yes.
It's the first time I've loaded Zoom onto this computer, so I was just a little bit unsure. So the HMIC update paper is actually fairly basic in terms of it gives a starting explanation of the HMIC FRS process, but that was intentional really because we were expecting potentially some new panel members. So apologies if you're already aware of some of the stuff that I'm quickly going to go through here. So a little bit of background to HMIC Peel Inspection Programme. It's the assessment of police effectiveness, efficiency and legitimacy for forces in England and Wales. In 2018, the process for Peel was evolved, and it evolved again in the last 12 months to what is described as more of a continuous assessment model. The way HMIC would describe this is it means taking greater use of the breadth of evidence that HMIC already collects on forces throughout the year to come to an assessment on performance. And some of the evidence sources that it will look at is each force's force management statement. And if you've seen a force management statement before, it contains a lot of information around the health of force, projections in terms of demand, financial position, future threats, that kind of information. So findings from thematic and joint inspections, and we will cover off later in this paper some of the recent thematic inspections, but very briefly, a thematic inspection is where HMIC will look at a particular topic area. They'll pick a number of forces in which to do that, and then they will feed back general findings, so not necessarily specific to the forces they've looked at, but general themes. And forces can use that information very often as learning and good practice if they're looking at developing a particular area within their own force, or if they have been one of the inspected forces. And there are some recommendations, they would look closely at those areas to see if there's things they need to do within their departments. The crime data integrity inspection. So the crime data integrity is very much around how good we are at taking the information that the public give to us and recording crimes. And we've heard recently about forces that haven't got good crime data integrity, and where there's a lot of missed crimes and underreporting. Therefore, you don't get that true reflection of demand within a force. So progress against either causes of concern or areas for improvement. So they're areas from previous inspections that HMIC has highlighted to say, West Midlands Police, this is an area we think you need to improve in and you need to focus on, or a bit more serious than that, you know, West Midlands Police, this is an area where we're really concerned and you need to perhaps do some, you know, more systematic changes to either your process or your policy in this area. Then routine data collection. So we do annual data returns to HMIC on specific areas, crime types, volumes, outcomes, that kind of information. And then the force liaison lead knowledge. So each force has a liaison officer who works for HMIC, and they're dedicated to the force that they work with. They work really closely with, for example, in this force, myself and Rachel, and they assess our progress against where we've had an area for improvement or a cause for concern. So they'll work with us to have a look at our progress, do some audit and assurance work, perhaps come back in and triangulate findings to make an assessment as to whether we're actually improving in the areas they've identified. The Peel assessment framework now, so the new assessment framework that we're operating under, which is continuous assessment, has three main areas. So it's an operational assessment, which looks at how well services are provided, an organisational assessment, so how well the police force is run, and then the service user assessment, which is the outcome from the perspective of those receiving the service, so our service users, end users, victims of crime. There's a number of questions that the HMIC give the force in advance. So it's quite a transparent process. They will say to us, this is what we're going to look at under each of those three areas. So it's a very open assessment. The judgment criteria for forces has also changed slightly with the new continuous assessment process, not massively. There's still the areas for improvement, which we talked about, and there's still the cause of concern, which we touched on, which are the two main feedback reporting mechanisms to the force around what they need to do to get better. But there is also a grading system, which is, it runs from outstanding to good, fair, requires improvement, and inadequate. The change in that assessment grading system is that they've included fair as a middle assessment line. It used to go from requires improvement to good, and there was no section in the middle. So that's an addition that they've put in. Also held within the paper is the timeline for the West Midlands Police current Peel inspection. So HMIC don't inspect all forces simultaneously. They do it staged. So most forces will know at what point HMIC are going to come in to do a Peel inspection. There's 5 forces in the country at the moment, I believe, that are currently going through inspection, and West Midlands Police is one of those forces. So the timeline that we are currently on for that inspection is it commenced in December with a document request, which is where we send out a number of documents and reports that they ask for, including a number of crime investigations in the different areas they want to assess. They will then do some internal meetings and then a specialist evidence gathering phase, which is where they will come in and actually review some of our crime investigations against a set criteria. And they will be looking for example, whether they're correctly allocated, whether the allocation is to the right department, whether the officer receiving the investigation has got the right skill set, the timeliness of investigations, the supervisory oversight of an investigation, the outcome of that investigation, and whether the outcome has been recorded correctly on the systems. There's other things, but just as a flavour for what they're looking at. The sample size that they use does have statistical significance. That was completed, so that section of looking at some of our work was completed in April. They then have a period of reflection on those findings, and they then come back into force to do what they call their fieldwork collection phase. The fieldwork collection phase for West Midlands started in May, and at the end of May, beginning of June, the Chief Constable and the Deputy Chief Constable did a strategic briefing to HMIC, and that is the Chief and the Deputy's opportunity really to explain the force to our main HMIC inspector, which is Wendy Williams. They go through, for example, the resourcing of the force, the finances of the force, the environmental context in which the West Midlands operates. So, you know, we're the biggest metropolitan force behind the Met. Some of the complexity that we face in the Midlands is very similar to what you would get in the Met. We've got some big sporting events and arenas here that, you know, attract national attention. We've got some really good stuff like Coventry City of Culture that we've invested a lot in. And then we attract a lot of complexity from things like demonstrations, so the Black Lives Matters and the Palestine March and things like that. So they explain the context of which West Midlands operates. The strategic briefing and presentation is also an opportunity for the Chief Constable to showcase some of the really good stuff that's taken place within West Midlands Police over the last few years, so particularly some of the transformation work and some of the really good outcomes from its investigation arena. Following that briefing, the inspection teams come into force. They go out and visit different locations. So they will do what they call the field work. They will drop in unannounced at locations, speak to officers, ask them questions. Again, there's nothing particularly hidden here. It's the questions that we are already aware of, the areas they're interested in as part of the assessment. And that fieldwork phase takes about a month to do. So we are currently in the middle of that fieldwork phase at the moment. We have inspectors in with us at the moment and out with our staff at the different locations. At the conclusion of the fieldwork phase, the HMIC liaison will do a hot debrief with the force. And what that is they'll sit down with the Chief Constable and the Deputy Chief Constable, and they will give us some verbal feedback on their findings. And that is findings of good practice in areas where they think we're doing particularly well, but also a heads up really as to areas that they think we are going to need to improve. And so a skeleton outline really of what we should expect to see in their final inspection report. HMIC then leave the force and they go away and they work through their findings. We sometimes get a few requests during that period if they think they've got a gap somewhere. And the final report will be published and produced and provided to the force in October of this year. So that's an overview of where we're at on that inspection at the moment.
That's helpful, actually. I mean, it may be that we haven't got any new members of the board yet with us, although some might be listening in. But actually, I think having a clear description like that of what the process is and how we're experiencing it is actually quite helpful to us. We hear the phrases. And having it described in more detail. I can see Richard's also nodding, so appreciate that. And you say you're in the middle of the field visits, so unconstrained by COVID, there are actually people physically out with the teams, is that right?
Yes, this is the first time that inspectors have gone into forces since the pandemic started. So during the first lockdown, a lot of the inspection officers were returned to forces to assist with demands, and all of the HMIC inspection work stopped and was paused. They restarted it again, as I say, at the end of last year. And this is the first time we've actually had the inspectors back on our estate. There's been quite a lot of work going into that to make sure that's done in a very safe way. So obviously lateral flow testing of all the inspectors, compliance with all of the COVID safety regulations we already have in force, but also where they will do, so I've talked about the field work, where it's unannounced visits. So, and that's to make it very fair and a very honest process, so that we can't, not that we would give departments the heads up that HMIC are coming or brief them in any way, because that would be very unprofessional to do that. But what they have done with us this time is share the locations they are going to be going into, so that at the centre, so myself and Rachel are able to make an assessment as to whether it is safe to go into those locations. So if we've had a particular outbreak of COVID, we would advise them and then, change the plans for that day and arrange for them to go into a different location. So far, so good. We've had one one small issue with an individual testing positive for COVID, but that's been dealt with really expeditiously, and there's no problems with that for us at the moment.
Okay, thank you very much. So that was on the whole Peel programme. Is there anything you need to draw our attention to on any of the updates on previous inspections that's also in the report, or is that much as it's written down?
I think I don't specifically need to go through the thematic inspections that's taken place. The paper covers that we've had 3 thematic inspections in the period since the last meeting. We were subject to the mental health inspection. There was some really positive feedback that came from that inspection, particularly around, I described earlier how a thematic inspection is done in a number of forces and is published to help, forces across the country make improvements. There was specific mention that West Midlands would be cited in that thematic inspection report as being an area that does a lot in terms of good practice. So other forces can then obviously look at what we're doing to replicate some of that good practice. So, so no, beyond that, I think I've covered everything.
Okay, thank you very much. And I see Neil has mentioned that actually that the inspectorate are dialing into force meetings, so that they're doing their observations in different ways. Thank you for that, Neil. Did anybody else want to come in and ask questions on any other aspect of the report? No. Okay. Okay. So CS Marsh, thank you very much. It's very, very full, and hopefully that report can be circulated to the new members of the boards. I think they may find that very helpful.
Thank you.
Okay. So that then takes us on to another inspectorate publication, which are their value for money profiles, which I think Davinder is going to present to us. So Davinder, we took some the previous committee took quite a bit of interest in the VFM report that came out. It must be now 3 years ago, I think, and was wanting to follow up on some of the information it gave us on where the West Midlands was an outlier, and although the force was quite happy to try and do that, struggled, I think, to get information from other forces, and then we had personnel changes. So, but this is a new set of information, and it throws up some new information. So, if you can introduce this to us, I think then Richard and I might want to just quiz, just to make sure they're listening and they're logging in. Grant Thornton on whether we can learn anything from other forces on how to use this information and make sense of it and work out what we do need to concentrate on. But over to Davinder first.
Thank you, Chair. Okay, if I start with a bit of, I suppose, setting the scene, really, just so we understand what this is telling us and sort of the nuances of it, but also maybe possible sort of shortcomings of it. So annually, HMRC FRS gathers spend data on a range of policing activities across the forces. And the data they actually use is what we submit to SIPVA through an exercise called the Police Objective Analysis. And the police objective analysis, it does set out descriptors for each of the sub-objective categories, the policing activities, but it can be open to interpretation. And the descriptors provided, the descriptors are provided, HMIC, FRS, do recognise that there are differences between how forces fit their data into those national categories. So there is going to be an element of subjectivity in this. So the output of the report, what it does is it highlights the differences in spend against each of the sub-objective categories, i.e. the policing activities. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't explain why those differences exist. And in some cases, those differences, can be due to sort of local decisions. So, for example, the number of front offices that a police force chooses to have can be very different to what other police forces decide. And HMRC themselves do recognise that that just because some costs may be reported as higher for some forces when compared to sort of the the most similar group, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's a sign of poor value for money. But conversely, it also recognises that cheapest isn't always the best either. So what Appendix 1 does in the report is it highlights where West Midlands Police are potential outliers when the spend is compared to a most similar sized group. So in terms of the most similar sized group, what for us, that includes Manchester, Merseyside and West Yorkshire. And it's actually based on social and urban demographics as per the census report. So that's the 2011 census report. So one, the data is quite old when it's grouping forces together. So again, that brings in a dimension too in terms of how accurate these findings are, or how much reliance you can place on these findings. So what we're doing with this paper at this point in time is just presenting the findings and trying to explain, I suppose, some of the obvious differences. But what we need to do is that further inspection and investigation piece. And it's twofold. One is actually talking to the operational teams and trying to understand how we've captured the costs and are they correct. And then the second piece is going out to the other forces, which you touched on, and understanding what costs they've captured. And is that comparable to what we've done? So, you know, at this point in time, I don't think any of the outliers is suggesting that they're areas of concern. It's just flagging an area which we need to look into. So what section 3 of the report does, it includes a table of the outliers, which are greater than plus or minus £2 when compared to, again, that most similar size, our most similar group. Section 4 of the report takes you through each of those outliers detailed in the table in section 3 to explain, where possible, from sort of the initial desktop review, why we think we might be an outlier. So, for example, we talk about the doctor's sub-objective category, and I think the report is suggesting that we don't spend as much in that area. But having just sort of initial conversation, we know the reason for that outlier is because our doctor's costs are included within the custody sub-objective category. So if we took the doctor's costs out of custody and we put them in the other line, actually we wouldn't actually be an outlier. And that would be the same, that would be the case for both custody and for the doctor's costs. So some of it is just about how things have been sliced and diced. But we do need to do more work on this. It's just to, I suppose, give you that further reassurance that these are these are anomalies just because of how things have been sliced and diced. But also, I suppose, for ourselves to just make sure that, you know, there aren't any real outliers out there which we need to investigate further. So next steps is talk to the operational teams around the cost capturing piece, and then speak to the other forces. We're hoping to come back to you with some specific details about, giving you that assurance that the potential outliers are or not areas of concern by September, and then doing some more deep dive work to again report again if that's what you would like in maybe the next meeting after the September meeting. Okay, so I'm hoping that's sort of giving you sort of the general theme of what this paper is trying to get across. But obviously happy to take any questions on that.
Thank you. I'll bring Richard straight in.
Thank you, Devinda. That's a really helpful kind of context, which I hadn't grasped when I read through the paper. Okay. And it's not a criticism of the author or the team putting the data together, but I got a bit, I don't know if it was me, I got a bit confused reading the paper because I didn't know whether I should be worried or comforted by the data. And I think your observation about just because we're cheaper by X amount per unit of service on a particular area of delivery, that may not indicate a problem. So the kind of the heads up about this is a work in progress is helpful. I guess my observation is what are the areas that you think we need to focus on, and do we ever get to a point where we're making comparable kind of exercises? Because I envisage that you've done all sorts of adjustments to get back to a number. you've probably got an opposite number in one of the other forces that's probably doing exactly the same, that may be moving further away. And I just wonder, at what point do we say we're confident that the data is useful for us to improve the service? That was quite a long question. I apologise.
That's okay. I think we're going to have to be, we'll need to be honest that actually I don't think we're ever going to get to a point where it's completely consistent across all the forces. And I think HMIC, FRS recognise that themselves. But through the POA exercise, which is obviously it's done annually, we will sense check, the data we submit through that, which will then in turn flow through this particular piece of work. So hopefully, as a force, we can take responsibility for making sure that around the accuracy of the data that we submit, but the rest of it is outside our control. Does that answer Sam's question? Yeah,
I think it does. It's not a perfect system, and it never will.
Yeah,
we understand the limitations. Just by way of a follow-up, do we ever benchmark against ourselves? And by that I mean, if we're recording activities and unit costs against elements of what we do consistently, then we're in a position to know year on year, are we cheaper or better than last year or the year before that or the year before that? So this is an outward-looking benchmarking approach in terms of how we compare Merseyside or Manchester. But do we ever kind of benchmark ourselves over a period of time whether we're getting better or not?
So I suppose part of the budget setting and budget monitoring process, we do sort of very high level pieces of work around that. I know in the past, Neil, there's been some exercises around costs, haven't there? Sort of benchmarking costs, but I personally haven't done anything recently. I don't know if Neil wants to come in here at all.
Yeah, if I may, Sue. So yeah, Richard, you're exactly right. What we need, what we have been doing in the past is monitoring that year-on-year cost and increase. We've done that through looking at things like priority-based budgeting, setting our service levels, understanding our demand, all the stuff that we've talked about at other audit committees around matching the supply we've got against the demand within the budget constraints we have, but also making sure we are maximising the benefit we do get from all the services and the investment we make. I just did want to pick up on one point, and Davina's exactly right. The POA and the VFM work that you see before you in this report has got better year on year, but I think for the reasons Davina has outlined, it's not perfect and it probably never will be. So we're always really mindful that we use a number of different lenses to look at this. This is really useful in terms of giving us a flag and potentially giving us areas to look at. We can go away and ask those questions of ourselves and other forces. But we do also look at some work we've been doing with SITFA on a sort of nationwide basis around more thematic spend. So spend on things like mental health rather than subjective spend on operational input and output. So we are trying to make sure we do cross-reference some of that, the work that we do. And Davina touched on there around unit costing. So earlier this year, we were part of a 3-force pilot. We made sure we were a part of that pilot because I think it's really, really valuable to us to look at our unit costing. So our officers took part in a sort of short survey for 10 days and different shifts that analysed how they spend their time. So we could get a bit more of a richer picture around how long some of these activities take within West Midlands and how that might differ from across other forces. That was sort of done by the Home Office. So with the results of those 3 pilots have been just announced. There are 2 further pilots taking place, and then we're looking to roll that out nationally. So then you start getting a more comparative tool that you can use across forces around how much do certain investigations take in certain areas, and then understanding, almost getting beneath the bonnet really of, that's not just costs, but it's time spent, equipment needed, fleet, etc., etc. So it will give a richer picture, and we'll be developing that all the time. So.
And that's very helpful. Thanks, Neil, and thanks, Davinda. That's helpful. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Neil. And I'm glad you mentioned the work that we're doing with SITFA, because the question that had occurred to me was, in a sense, to go right back to the beginning of the process, which was if SIPA were asking for a slightly different set of data, might that be more helpful? I mean, is there input from the forces towards what SIPA asked for that would better refine what was being gathered, so that the first thing we had to do was not comparing whether we got A in this category as opposed to the next force who got B in it, and which it's interesting. You can see from the working that we've been doing that we end up doing a lot of checking back and checking across in order to see whether what we've got is comparative. So can I just ask Mark or Neil, is there input into what SIPA start how they start the whole exercise?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, Sue, Mark and I are both quite visible nationally. So
yes,
I represent CFOs at the what's called the NPCC, National Police Chiefs Council, and Mark has a similar role on the Police and Crime Commissioners Treasury Society. So we are both, quite, I think, quite influential in that space. I'll make sure I'm third. So I don't know, Mark, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, sure. I just echo really what Neil said and what everybody else has said really about the report in terms of it being a tool around. It's like one of many tools really to sort of suss out the costs and benefits and the value for money arrangements for the force and the PCC. So yeah, really everything what's said, and like I say, we can influence that sort of data collection exercise.
Okay, so then I want to ask a question before we finish on the topic about two particular items that are in the list. But I wonder if I could just ask Ian from Grant Thornton, do you see other forces engaged in the same sort of exercise as us in thinking, well, what have we got to do to make sure we can make sense of this? Absolutely. I mean, have other forces a different approach to what they do with this information?
So I think everybody goes through the same, it asks themselves the same question and goes through the same process. I think people do it in slightly different ways. I think it's some of these things are quite useful as a starting point, and that's it's like any piece of information or any piece of sort of benchmarking and those sorts of things, isn't it? Is that you can that you need to get behind it to actually understand what it's telling you, to then determine what are the actions that you need to do, and to really understand what it's saying, because a lot of the time people collect the same information, ostensibly the same information, but in slightly different ways, and so I think everybody goes through the same kind of the same process. It's just people go about it in slightly different ways, if that makes sense.
Okay, well, I mean, what I do see here is a genuine attempt to understand it and make use of it if there is something that we need to be adjusting, and that's the important thing. So just so before we finish the consideration of the paper, there are the vast majority of things that appear don't look on the face of it to be hugely significant, but there are two areas where we are outliers, and were outliers last year, and by rather larger sums than most of the rest. And one is incident and response management, where we spend significantly less than others, it appears. And the other is advanced public order, where we spend rather more than others, it appears, not quite to the same degree. So since they both appeared in the list last year, is there anything we know about those two areas that we can already take into account that would assist us in our sort of our thinking on what we need to take forward? Jonathan, I don't know if your hand is up in response to that question I've just asked, or the rather earlier discussion.
It's in relation to the earlier. It's the earlier discussion, Sue. I was going to make an observation, but it's not relating to this question now. But I'm interested to hear the answer. That's for sure.
Okay, so who can pick that up? Neil.
This is where I really wish the Deputy Chief Constable was sitting alongside me. But I mean, obviously we'll come back with greater clarity soon, but my initial view is, I think, is the way we have response set up in the force as separate hubs. We are different from a lot of forces who have local policing units who do neighbourhood policing and respond and do the roads policing all from one neighbourhood, whereas we have a more centralised function, and I think we glean the benefit from that. Also, I guess, you know, whilst we're a very busy force and very city centre centric, we are quite small in comparison. So the cost of travel, etc., and the miles travelled wouldn't be as great as some of our more rural colleagues. In terms of the public order, again, I can only put that down to the size of the force and the level of, I mean, we do have a number of city centres that we have to police. Obviously, you know, I think as Caroline touched on earlier, it's the number of protests, etc., that we have. Therefore, the number of deployments of public order we would expect to see. So I can come back with greater detail there with just my initial observations.
Okay, well, I think for the agenda next time, Lynn, I'm just looking at if we can note, and if the minutes can record that specifically at the next meeting we just want to come back up to those two topics, and hope well we've arranged the meetings with the intention that we've fitted into the Deputy Chief Constable's diary. So it may be that, you know, if she's with us, she can give us a fuller response, because I don't want to contest with what you've just said, Neil, but particularly in the public order point, I do recall that our response to what might fall out of the bill that's currently going through Parliament on policing was relaxed about the impact here, because we don't generate quite so many protests, and we have very good relationships with the people who might be doing the protesting, so that wouldn't necessarily tie in with your thoughts on this, but I'm simply posting that as an initial thought, and we'll come back to those two items at our next meeting in September if we can. Thank you very much for that. Thank you very much, Devinder, for your input. I know that you won't be staying in the meeting, so thank you for that. Very helpful.
Thank you.
Okay, so we can then move on to the annual governance statements, and just before bringing Mark and Ravi in, can I just say I was delighted to read the annual governance statements and to see the weight that the actions of internal audit and the audit committee were given in demonstrating good governance. It was very good to read a third party report that saw the value of this committee. So delighted by that. Thank you. Mark, do you want to introduce this?
Yeah, so I'm going to do the whole item actually, Sue. Thanks for that introduction. So as a way of a further introduction, you have on the agenda the two annual governance statements, one for the force and one for the PCC. As you know, it sort of details the overall arrangements in terms of governance, including things like the police and crime plan, the board, the forces governance structures, sort of the holding to account function, and the sort of day-to-day sort of processy procedural documents we have in place, things like the joint scheme of governance that audit committee reviews on a regular basis. The statements also include a review of effectiveness. This year, for the first time, we've included a section on the compliance with SIPTA's financial management code. This is designed to support good practice in financial management and to assist police organisations like ourselves in sort of demonstrating sustainability. We've done an annual compliance review of the actual code across the PCC and the force. As part of that, as part of the introduction of the code in its shadow year, the majority of the assessment was RAG rated green with no areas of concern. Therefore, we're confident that the force and the PCC have complied with the principles of around the code, of which is obviously good financial management. The documents highlight significant governance issues, and those, and they actual detail a criteria for actually highlighting what is a significant governance issue. Obviously, COVID was a major issue within the last financial year, and obviously continues to be an issue across policing. It details in the governance statement sort of day-to-day, sort of hints at the day-to-day sort of arrangements around managing COVID and how the Police and Crime Commissioner, should I say, is hold to account the arrangements around that. Also highlights within that significant governance issues the work internal audit did on missing and the subsequent work that the force has done in the early part of this calendar year. And the usual sort of points are made in there around the sort of limited resources and the difficulty we have in financial planning around a number of financial years when we only have a 1-year settlement. It then talks about as well how the issues raised in previous governance statements, particularly around sex offender management and the issue around legacy IT systems and systems across the force have been addressed. So we comment in the forces governance statement around the effectiveness, and it goes down into SITFA's arrangements around the core principles of how that is managed. And also both documents highlight sort of the effectiveness of the governance arrangements. There's also a document attached as appendices which maps out the sort of activity that takes place across the force and PCC in line with those 7 core principles. There's an amber rating in one of them that highlights sort of the issues around managing data, and that relates to the sort of legacy systems, which we're obviously moving out now because of the implementation of the major systems that have taken place recently. So that's the introduction. Happy to take any questions.
Sue, I think you're on mute.
I am on mute. I was just saying I didn't think there were any questions, and Richard's his hand up. Richard.
Yeah, it was just an observation, really. I just want to thank everybody involved, because I thought it was a really comprehensive description of the activity of both organisations. And I know, Sue, when you and I spoke recently, we talked about kind of to our reading of it, there was more emphasis on kind of outcomes and outputs this year than process. So I just wanted to say thank you and compliment everybody involved, really.
Indeed, and that was what I was saying when I was on mute. So we're of one mind, and we don't need to dwell further on that item on the agenda. Thank you, Mark. We can move on to the statement of accounts, and I think Ravi is going to introduce those for us.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So just a bit of kind of context behind the statement of accounts. It's split up into 2 documents. There's a statement of accounts for the Chief Constable, and there's also a group accounts which separates out the PCC's office. And that's really just to recognise the kind of separate status of the 2 bodies, really. I'm mostly going to focus on the group accounts because inevitably there is some repetition because the Chief Constable's numbers are incorporated within the group accounts. But obviously happy to take kind of questions on either set. The deadline for publishing the accounts has been pushed back, so we're well within that time frame. So the publishing of the draft accounts, the deadline was the 31st of July, and the publishing of the audited accounts is the 30th of September. And the reason for that pushback is obviously the kind of COVID impact, and so that's for this year and for next year, those deadlines. So the statement of accounts is obviously, it can be a complex document. It's a comprehensive document. It's prepared in line with the CIPFA Code of Practice on local authority accounting and interprets the international financial reporting standards, which are required to base out accounts on. Perhaps the most useful part of the statement of accounts for non-accountants is the beginning part of the document, which is the kind of the narrative statement starting on page 3, and really that sets the context of the force and the structure of the force, the activities over the past financial year, and the future outlook as well. There is a section detailed management accounting outturn. And that kind of details kind of what's the forces, how the forces manage their budget. And so in total, the group has spent £610 million for the year. And I'll come on in a little while to kind of how that differs from the accounting basis. So really, that's the kind of controllable budget, or what we say is the general fund of spend of the group. Clearly elsewhere in the document, there's also kind of the AGS, which is just repeating the documents that Mark just went through. If we then come on to page 33 of the group accounts, we have the comprehensive income and expenditure statement. So this is what in the private sector would be, typically your profit and loss account. So this is prepared on an accounting basis rather than a kind of a budget basis. So the number in that document is substantially different to what the budget is. So this includes things like statutory overrides, so things like depreciation, which are not real kind of cash transactions, but more of an kind of accounting adjustment. So you will notice in there, one of the biggest items is the pension adjustment, which I'll come on to in some more detail in a couple of minutes, because I think it's important. On page 35, we've got the movement in reserve statement. So that tracks the movement between the different types of reserves. So you've got the general fund, which is really what's applicable to the taxpayer, if you like. And then you've got other funds kind of broken down between usable and non-usable reserves. If we go onto the balance sheet, bear with me a second, just bring it up. If we go onto the balance sheet, you'll see that the overall net liability for the group has increased by £769 million. Now, obviously, that's a huge number, but this is mostly down to the pension liability. So the pension liability is split into two parts, because there's a pension scheme for police officers, and there's a pension scheme for police staff, which includes the kind of PCC's office as well. The pension scheme for police officers is an unfunded defined benefit scheme, which means there are no assets that have been built up to fund the liability. So basically, during the year, any payments that become payable have to be covered. Any shortfall is covered by a grant from the Home Office. So to give you an idea, the shortfall for this year is expected to be around £80 million. So that is covered by a grant from the Home Office. Now, the reason for the increase in that liability is due to a reduction in the discount rate and an increase in the salary and inflation rate. So these are actuarial assumptions. Now, even a small decrease in the discount rate can have a huge impact on liabilities, because it just means the future cash flows are kind of today's values of future cash flows are significantly more. So you do get wild swings really, kind of year to year in that pension liability. The pension scheme for police staff is a funded scheme. So it's run by the West Midlands Pension Fund for West Midlands Police. So that does have assets that are that fund the liability really, and those assets are invested into various different things, various different assets. So that can be the stock market, can be bonds, can be property, and so they have to provide a valuation on that as well. So that's really the kind of the reason for that huge impact increase in liabilities. Apart from that, I'm not intending to go through each of the notes in detail, The only other thing I'd mention is our external valuers have provided a valuation for our property portfolio, and they've included a material uncertainty clause, and this is due to the uncertainty that resides in the property market as a result of COVID-19. And that is in line with a lot of other kind of public sector bodies, where their valuers have gone back with similar comments. And indeed, it's in line with our pension assets that we have invested in property. External audit have commenced their audit, and I'm sure they'll probably say something when they come on to it. But yes, we are looking to get the audit complete by the required deadline, which is 30th September, and bringing it back to joint audit committee then. Happy to take any questions.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Ravi. I was very interested. It was it's not a question, but it was very helpful. And I can't find it now. I should have made a note of which page it was on, to see the chart that showed you what the cost of various actuarial assumptions were on the pension costs. I don't recall having seen that before. I might just have missed it. I mean, it's interesting, and it might have changed next year. But I think it just gives us a feel for why there are these fluctuations in the valuations. It's such a huge sum. Richard, you've got a question?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Yes, Ravi, thanks for the paper. I think it's really comprehensive. I'm just interested. I think Mark or Neil in the earlier item touched on the challenges of just having an annual settlement that comes in, and I just wonder to what effect does that impact upon the movement in the numbers between year? Do we get wide movements between year, because obviously the government may push down a particular route to fund a particular activity? You may not have a view on that, I don't know.
I think if I just come in on that, Richard, from my perspective, so it doesn't help obviously in terms of a longer term financial planning perspective, and the lack of certainty around both funding but also preset flexibility that the force will get. And I think the biggest challenge for us is more on the management accounting side and managing the day-to-day accounts. I think in terms of the statement of accounts going forward, I think the only thing that really has hit us this year, I think, is a bit of some funding that arrived from the Home Office at the last minute, so for specific purposes. So from the reader's perspective, you'll see the number of reserves will have increased, but a big driver of that is either we had Home Office funding for a specific purpose and we didn't get it until the last week in March, or we had uplift funding for the logistical side of uplift, so things like buying fleet or property as our uplift in terms of number of officers. This is over a 3-year period and won't all be spent in year one, so will have to be carried forward to be used in future years. So I think from a reader of the accounts perspective, it can just be a little bit confusing if we're not careful around the level of reserves is increasing, but we've still got financial challenges within the force. But all of those reserves are virtually earmarked for a specific purpose. So.
Thanks, Neil. Can you just clarify where you get a grant or whatever it is that's received very late in the financial year? Do you have the facility to carry that forward as an unspent item, do you? Because I know from my time way back in the mists of time in local government, you had this kind of mad kind of arms race to spend money because you would lose it if you didn't spend it.
Yeah, it very much depends on the terms and conditions attached with the grant, and we have to kind of comply with that. Typically, kind of, I'd say quite a few of the Home Office grants that we do get are what we would class as unrestricted. So they identify it for a particular purpose, but you don't have to necessarily kind of use it within that time frame. There are some government grants where we have to use it within a specific time frame, so inevitably there is that pressure to get the money spent. But otherwise, we want to use it in the best way possible, and if it's unrestricted, we will look to carry it forward to a future financial year if that's the most effective use of the funds.
Thank you.
Thanks, Richard, for that.
Sorry, Sue, can I just come in there?
Yes, Mark.
Our experience in the Police and Crime Committee's offices we have had a lot of grants where we have to spend them in year. So the ones what for the general police force tend to be over a number of years, but the ones we've had through the PCC's office for crime reduction activities tended to be you have to spend them very quick, which is obviously not a very desirable position to be in terms of sort of planning. So just want to make that point.
Okay, thank you. One comment I'd make on just the presentation of the case. You said right at the beginning, Ravi, the group accounts contain the force's statement. So you know, we can just look at the one document. But I read the force paper first, and what was actually interesting, you know, when I then came to read the group position and was reflecting back, was that if all you read was the force paper, you wouldn't know how the actual spend compared to what the budget was. So the fact that almost the first thing that the group position says is the force underspent by, was it 26 million? If you'd only read the force account, you wouldn't know that, and that's not a problem, because you know that wasn't the information it was giving you. It was simply telling you what was spent. But I did think that was quite interesting that the two have a slightly different approach to what they're reporting, and therefore you do need it forces diligence, because you have to read both to get the full position. Yeah, they are very clear, and the notes, as you said, the notes and the context at the outset are what actually gives you the flavour for what's happened this year. So I don't have any further questions. Neither does Richard. So I'll just echo what Neil's just put in the chat to thank Ravi and all the team for the work that they've put in, because the quality of the papers and the presentation of the information, you know, it is actually very good, and which is why you don't get loads of questions, because we certainly don't need to ask questions about what does it mean, because the information is very clearly set out. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Okay, right, I am. It's now 10 to 11. And I'm going to suggest that we take a short break so that everyone can have a comfort break, and that we resume with the papers on internal and external audit at 11. Is everyone happy with that? Okay, so we'll go dark for a short period, and the meeting will resume at 11 o'clock. Okay, I hope everyone is back with us. I will just wait for my clock to say 11, since that's what I said to people. Okay, so we'll resume, and we've now got 3 reports from the head of internal audit, Lynn Joyce. So starting off with your annual report, Lynn, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, so this is the internal audit annual report, and it includes the head of audit's opinion for the year based on the work completed by the team. Just to give you very brief highlights coming from the report. So we completed 25 assurance audits throughout the year. And I think it's clear to say that the higher proportion of those received reasonable assurance. And this year, I think there was 4 substantial assurance as well. So it shows a really good picture, and it demonstrates that there's a good framework of control in place, and there's consistent application of those controls largely across the board. There was just one audit that received minimal assurance, which Mark alluded to earlier as part of the annual governance presentation, which was around the follow-up work that we did on the missing persons process, which members will be familiar with from the reports they've received throughout the year. So that was still an area of concern for us, but just to reassure the committee on that one, in the last few weeks, we've actually done a follow-up of that audit, and it's shown substantial improvement. So that will be coming through to committee at some point in the future. But this is reflecting on the work of last year. So last year we issued 88 recommendations. Whilst none of those were rated high, I should actually say that the missing recommendations, obviously from the previous year, still stood. So but we haven't double counted those in last year's figures. So we followed up on 44 audits throughout the year, and 73% of the recommendations from those audits were fully implemented, and an additional 7% were partly implemented. And throughout the year, members will have had updates on those also. So I think that shows a really good picture. We did see a slight decline in implementation in the earlier parts of the year, largely as a result of COVID, but I think it's fair to say towards the end of the year that started to improve. In terms of the effectiveness of the internal audit team, we've done a self-assessment against the standards, and we still feel that we're 100% compliant with those standards. We've addressed the recommendations that came out of the inspection a few years ago, and we're still looking for opportunities to improve, which you'll see outlined in the next report. So I think generally it shows a really good picture. Our feedback's really good. We've got 96% of our PAQ scoring good or very good, and really positive comments coming back. That's consistent with previous years. The outturn on the plan was really good. We've got 94% of the plan. There's still a couple that we're in the process of finalising, but generally I think it shows a really good picture of both the internal audit team and the force and the OPCC, and that's resulted in the reasonable assurance opinion that I've given in the report. So happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Lynn, and thank you again for you and your team for the flexible way in which you've managed to get through as much of the plan as you have in the last year. It wasn't at all the best of years, to be trying to work in internal audit. But you know, with you, all of your team soldiering on, you've got I think a very good response. And I have to say, if there were no limited or minimal assurance reports, I'd be much more worried than being in a position where 20% of the reports are in that category, because it would suggest to me we weren't looking in the right places. You know, every organisation, as you said, there's always a desire to do better than you are, and there always are areas where both the team and the organisation can do better, and it's the job of the team to help find those. So I think this is it's a satisfactory place to be in, and it shows not simply that the work is good, but the work's in the right place. Okay, so are there any questions then on the report? No, I don't think so. Okay, so as we gave thanks to the finance team, then perhaps you will pass back our thanks to the whole audit team for the work that they've done. I know several of them are on the call anyway, but it's been, you know, it's been very, very good year given the context in which we were working. Thank you. So do you want to move on to your report on quality assurance and improvement then, Lynn?
Okay, thank you, Chair. So members again will be familiar with this report. It's a requirement of the public sector internal audit standards that we present this report annually. And again, this just links back to the previous presentation I've just given, and summarises the effectiveness of the audit team. So as part of our effectiveness review, we undertake a self-assessment against the public sector internal audit standard requirements. That was undertaken in April, and I think, as I said, we've shown full compliance against those. We feel like we're in a good position for our next assessment, which is due next year. We've got to undertake it every 5 years, so our next one's due by October 22. So we'll commence planning for that inspection later this year, and obviously consult members with the best way that should be conducted. What this does show is in Appendix B, it includes a progress update on some of the improvement actions that we'd previously identified. And I think it's fair to say that some of those haven't been progressed as much as we could have done. But, you know, events prevailed last year in terms of some of the activity. One of them was potentially doing an upgrade to our working paper system. I think that one was delayed initially because the software provider stopped doing the user groups in order for us to actually see what the system could provide us. But also we're waiting for the rollout of Office 365 as a potential alternative to explore if that could be used rather than the system that we're currently using. And that rollout's starting to commence now, so hopefully that action can be implemented this year. The second one was around the elapsed time for audits, which is something that we'll continue to work on. We had a slight hiccup last year with obviously progressing that because we had to change our working practices. But this year we're moving to a more agile approach of working on fewer audits to try and get them through the system a lot quicker. So we are sort of working on those objectives, and there's a couple more that we've identified. One which the committee will be familiar with is that we didn't have any private meetings with the members for internal and external audit last year, which I think is a practice that we need to try and resurrect this year as good practice. And the second one is, as members will be aware, the force has implemented a lot of new systems this year. So it's just about me taking stock with the Assistant Director of IT on any sort of gaps in the assurance framework that we might have as a result of that implementation. So that's something that I'll be progressing quite early on in the year. So other than that, what the report does actually show also is the QUAPE for 2021-22, and there's no changes on that compared to last year. So that's it. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Lynn. And just to follow up on your point about the private meetings, we have got at the next meeting a meeting scheduled with external audit. I do hope that will be in person. Let's hope that is possible. But I think those, by their nature, those meetings need to be places where you can ask the awkward question and the uncomfortable question, and be sure you're getting a completely open answer. And that's not always best done when you're online. But we will certainly recommence those. Right, Richard, you've got a question?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Yeah, thank you, Lynn. And I've just seen Neil's message pop up, and I'd like to associate myself with that about what a good work you've done this year in difficult circumstances. You answered my question about the 5-year external audit assessment in your speech, your kind of introduction. Given that you're a small audit team, are there any elements of the standards that are kind of onerous or an impediment to you? Because these are often written for people who are one-man bands, right up to really large, government agencies that run to several hundred internal auditors. So just interested in any views you have on that.
No, I don't think there are actually, because a lot of the standards, when you read the interpretation of them, they do allow some exceptions for small teams. I suppose some of the aspects that we do miss out on opportunities for, and you mentioned it prior to this meeting, was some of the tools that some larger organisations might use, like data interrogation tools. And we're such a small team that we can't do that continuous auditing regime that some bigger audit teams actually do. So from that perspective, I think as a small team, you do miss out on some opportunities to do some more proactive work. But I don't think the standards, I think the standards allow for that. And I think we stack up pretty well, to be honest. The regime that we've got good relationships with both the Force and the OPCC. It's quite an open and transparent relationship. We use a standard working paper system that's well known throughout the industry. And that helps us comply because it regiments the way that we work. So I don't think that we're sort of held back in any way because of the limited resources, but we probably are missing opportunities that we could do if we had a bigger team and undertake that more continual assessment process.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much for that. So just to clarify in terms of the external assessment, Lynn, are you expecting to bring a recommendation to the September committee, or is that more likely to be December in terms of appointment and appointment of someone to do it and the scope of it?
I think what I'll probably do, Chair, is for the September meeting, I'll bring an options paper, because there's various ways that an assessment can be done. It can be self-assessment, peer review, external commissioning. So if I bring an options paper to committee next time, when there'll potentially be a bit more members there, and we can explain the process in a bit more detail also. That's
good, because if we weren't considering that till December, then it wouldn't get done in 21-22, would it? So I think that's the right time frame. Okay, that's good. That's fine. Thank you.
We should be going on to procurement early next year with a view to getting it sort of autumn time. So that's the right timeline.
Good. Okay, thank you. Okay, I can't see that there are any other questions. So then you move on to your third paper, which is the current year audit update. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chair, again. So again, this is just a review of the work since the previous meeting of the committee. We've finalised 7 audits during the period, and we've got 1 in draft awaiting management comments. In addition to those audits that we've completed, we've done 13 follow-ups to date this year, and actually they're showing quite good progress, with 86% either implemented or partly implemented. And I think what we have seen is a number of the long overdue recommendations included in that batch of 13 follow-ups that have now been cleared. And that leaves us with just 26 significant recommendations that are in progress. But I will say, if you do look at the management responses to those, they do show that they are in progress. They're just not at that stage where we can close them off yet. So in addition to that routine assurance work, where members will be familiar with the National Fraud Initiative exercise, So we're in the process of investigating the matches from that exercise, and just to put some scale to that, there was 2,000, just over 2,000 matches that were put forward to us to investigate. So we have to prioritise the work we do on that, and we're obviously focused on the priority areas, which is deceased pensioners and the creditors' payment, but looking at the higher quality matches within that 2,000. So at the moment, there was only 64 of that 2,000 that were relating to deceased pensioners, and we believe that 9 of those weren't previously known. So a stop was put on those immediately, so that no further pension payments were made, and we're just waiting for confirmation of the overpayment figures that might be impacted by that. So we'll come back in September with hopefully some firm figures. And we're in the early stages of looking at the creditor matches, and it looks like we've found a handful of potential duplicates. So as well as that, we're going to investigate the reasons for those duplicates and come back with a potential value on those to the next committee. But we'll continue with those investigations throughout the year. It does take some time. That's why the assessment, that exercise is only done every couple of years, because it does take us some time to go through those matches. But nevertheless, we'll report back in due course. I think the performance section, as you'll see, I've reported the figures for last year because it's too soon in the reporting year to report this year's progress. And those were discussed already in the annual report section. So that just leads on to the one limited report that was issued during the quarter. And I should say that this report, which relates to the Victim Service Assessment Team, I think the opinion is largely as a result of the infancy of the team. I think if we would have gone back, if we would have done the audit a few months later or 6 months later, it might have been a different position. So this team isn't a requirement for the force to have. It's a proactive team that's been set up by the force. And its aim is really to look at the vulnerability themes that are coming out of HMIC FRS reports, internal audit reports, and wider vulnerability across the force, to make sure that actions and improvements are being made in those areas of weakness that have been identified. And members will probably recognise that vulnerability has been a common theme for some of the limited opinion reports that have been coming through to committee. So it's a welcome addition for us that this team's been set up. But I think, you know, it's when we look at the limited opinion, I would caveat that it's based purely on the fact that it's in its infancy and it's still in development stage. So the audit did pick up on a lack of established arrangements around governance, around sort of the prioritisation of inspection themes, and some aspects of the process, and potentially missed opportunities to identify other weaknesses in vulnerability areas that potentially weren't coming out of inspections. So what management were reasonable, have agreed all of the audit actions and have taken those forward. But what we've also built into our audit plan this year is some advisory work to work with that team, because to share the way that we work as well with that team, because it's a similar type of regime. They do sample testing on cases and investigations, similar to how we do in some of our inspections. So we've got some time set up to actually work with the team to help develop those processes and get it on a stronger footing so that we can place reliance on the work that they're doing, which is actually a requirement of the standards, which says if we do need to rely on other assurance providers, we have to assure ourselves on the robustness of their work. So that is all I want to really say about that report. But we have got Gemma, who did the audit on the meeting, and also Chief Superintendent March, who presented the HMIC update earlier, has also stayed on the call because she actually has taken over responsibility for this area, just as the audit was completing. So we've got Gemma and Chief Superintendent Marsh on the call too. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that, Lynn. And I mean, I take into account, you know, you're saying it's a very new team, and so just in respect to that last report, we might want to go back to other elements of your paper. But you know, you could have gone you could have waited another 6 months and then come back and actually things weren't bedded in, and then people there might have been wasted time because people weren't aware of some of the shortfalls. So I think it's probably very helpful that the audit has been done early on and has picked up some areas where some action needs to be taken early on, and it also, I think, is going to be very useful for this analysis to have been done because the new commissioner has appointed a victims commissioner. I think actually this will be quite a useful set of information for her. So I think it could be timely. So did anybody want to, I mean, did either CS Marsh or Gemma want to make any further comment on that specific report?
Nothing from me, Chair. I think Lynn gave a detailed update as to obviously the findings and how we're going to take things forward, working with the team going forward.
Okay, thanks, Gemma. Chief Superintendent, did you want to come in?
Only really to say that we found the report really helpful. Actually, I would describe it as a bit of a roadmap, really. So the force has made the decision that whilst the team was established as a temporary function in the lead up to HMIC, particularly around the crime data integrity part of the inspection, the value of the work the team does has been recognised, and the decision has been made that it will be established as a permanent function moving forward. So the recommendations in Gemma's report and the offer to work with the team will be really, really helpful in how we actually establish the team as a permanent function moving forward. And we're definitely going to accept any help we can get in terms of making sure that our end product is as good as it possibly can be.
Good, thank you. Richard, anything from you?
Thank you, Chair. Lynn and I spoke earlier on in the week, and I think I'd expressed initial concern about some of the gaps really around kind of ownership and prioritisation, and asked Lynn whether these were things that should have been designed in at the start. But I understand kind of the newness of this function, and from Lynn's introduction, I'm reassured that progress is already being made on this. So I think I'm not as concerned as I was. So.
Okay, thank you. So did you have any questions on anything else in the paper, Richard?
No, Chair, I haven't. No, thank you.
Okay, I just wanted to pick up one other area, Lynn, and that's on the outstanding recommendations. You said, you can see from the management responses that things are in progress, but the one area where there's a 2 or 3 recommendations where I wasn't so reassured that was up to date was in terms of the appropriate adults areas where the update in the paper is from December, and some of the updates at that point said things would be happening in February, but we've not heard back. So I'm not looking to you necessarily to be able to comment on that at this stage, but I think that's a priority for ensuring that when we next meet, that we have got some further comment and update on those, and unless you make the inquiry and find that actually there is something comprehensive now, in which case you could perhaps just ensure that members of the committee have got it available to them, because that's probably the one area where we've not got something that sort of relates to the current, where we've got something in this year.
No, that's fine. Thank you, Chair. Just to reassure you on that, we are in the process of doing a follow-up, and we did receive some responses. We have gone back for some clarification and additional evidence just to close some of those off. But what I didn't have that in time to actually update the report with that position before it went out. So next time, or once I've got those, I'll send them out to you just to reassure you in the interim, because September's quite a long time to wait to get that reassurance.
Yes, it
but
is.
We
okay.
are following it up. We're just seeking clarity.
That's fine then. Okay, if you can do that, that's good. Does anyone have anything else they want to raise on this report? No. Okay, so thank you, Lynn and the team for that. And we will move on to item 13, which is a progress report and a sector update from external audit. It's mostly a sector update. It has to be said this time. So, Ian, anything you want to say on that, or Laurelyn, whichever?
I think Laurelyn was going to just briefly say something. So.
Okay, Laurelyn.
Yeah, well, as has been pointed out, this is mostly sector update rather than progress update. So we presented our audit plan to the committee in March, and since then, sort of minimal work has been done because it's been that period where the finance team have kind of been closing down and preparing the accounts. So our planning work got us to the point that we would like to be at this point in the year, and we kind of kicked off our year-end visit on Monday this week. So early days, but we are currently in the process of completing the audit. So there is very little to actually update you on. But yes, work is ongoing. The sector update obviously includes kind of key things that we think might be of interest, and also includes a few pages again on the new approach to value for money, which is changing this year.
Okay, that's good. Okay, does anyone have any questions they want to ask arising from the sector update? No. Okay. So as we said, we've got our private meeting as a committee with you at the next meeting. But as I will be continuing as chair for the next 3 years, hopefully we can also have a one-to-one before we get to the next committee with you. And once the membership of the committee has been confirmed from the new members of the police board, we would hope that we might be able to construct a training programme and a sort of induction into the audit element for new members that you might have some input into, because apart from anything else, I think the work that you do in other forces is sort of useful for members to see. So we hope we'll be in touch with you too.
Very happy to do that, Steve. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so if there's nothing further on that, item 14 is the annual report of the committee. Much of this was previewed in my comments at the last meeting when it wasn't clear I would be continuing, but was looking back over the last year. I think that the committee has actually had a good year as well. It's worked well through these virtual meetings, and I would just pay tribute again to the previous members of the committee who were always very well prepared and very thoughtful in their questioning, and I hope that the new committee will prove to be as rigorous in its work of interrogating the organisations as we go forward. But I won't say anything further on the report. If anyone wants to raise any questions, very happy to answer them. Nobody has, as far as I can see. And therefore, the final item is the work programme for the audit committee for the rest of the year. This will also potentially be subject to some change once we see the new police and crime plan, and whether there's anything we need to be turning our attention to as a result of that. But that's the work plan as we currently envisage it. Is everyone happy with that? Okay, so that brings us to the end of our business. I was expecting it would be a slightly shorter meeting when you've got 2 members rather than 5. however much we try to make up, it does tend to mean that we've got a slightly shorter period of time needed for the meeting. So thank you everyone who's been in the meeting, for your attendance, for those of you who've been presenting, for the usefulness and clarity of your reports. And we will hopefully see everyone again in September for the next meeting. I hope everyone has a safe and enjoyable summer in the meantime. So I'll call the meeting to a close now. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Sure.